Hello, historians. Welcome back. This is the next episode or the next lesson in our series talking about World War II. And here we are discussing the home front and civilians. So what was happening on the home front? What was happening at home in various places like Germany and Britain and the United States and Japan? What was the civilians thinking and doing during this time? Let's find out. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about, the wartime strategies, post-war events that happened during World War II. Here are your vocabulary. If you have the paper version, then the top of the paper version got a little bit messed up, but these are the two words for your vocabulary: kamikaze and blitz. You heard me mention blitzkrieg before, but this is a shortened term used by the British to describe the German raids that happened on British cities. And of course, kamikaze is a suicide mission by a Japanese pilot. No, we are not talking about a certain drink, and we're not talking about football, but we are talking about World War II. So let's go ahead and start. All right, so here is number 1, 2, and 3. Okay, in the Soviet Union, they decided to ship and dismantle their factories and move them to the Urals, the Siberia and Volga regions. Why? Because it is extremely cold, and they knew that the German advances or the German army would not be able to get in that area. They did not know the area. They would freeze. They would be lost, and that's exactly what happened in the Battle of Stalingrad, right? As we talked about before. So the Soviet women also played a major role here as civilians, and they worked in the industries, the mines, and the railroads. But the Soviet Union was the only country that allowed women to fight in battle. There were snipers and air crews for bomber squads, right? No other nation allowed their women to fight in battle except for the Soviet Union, all right? They were doing their thing. So here we go. That's number 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 and 2. Number 1 and 2 only. This is number 3, 4, and 5. In the United States, was very valuable to the Allied powers because the United States made sure that the battle was not fought in their territory or on U.S. soil. And because of that, and also, as you see here, right here, it produced a lot of the, it produced a lot of the military equipment, and they had a lot of military equipment. They were an industrialized, capitalized country that can create war equipment very fast. So that was the case here, and because of that, the United States had a big advantage over the Axis powers. Okay. Also, women began working in the munitions factories while their husbands or their families, their men, were out fighting the war. They were taking up those same positions that their men had, and they were working on the war equipment for the war. And this is a picture of Rosie the Riveter, who's depicted as this woman. And it was used as a poster to promote and persuade women to join the cause, to join in and work so that they can help win the war, right? Also, African Americans, blacks, and not just in the United States, but also in the Caribbean. People in the Caribbean also joined the military in order to help with the war effort. As you see here, 1 million African Americans joined the military, but even though they joined, they were still in segregated units. Okay, racism did not stop even for war. Okay, and that's your answer for number 3, 4, and 5. This is your answer for number 6. Explain the purpose of the poster here, service on the home front. This poster, and if you notice here, this is actually what Rosie the Riveter was supposed to be. Okay, Rosie the Riveter was really the African American women and some of the people of color that were working on the industrial factories creating the war materials for World War II for the United States. This poster, as you see here, promoted American families to join the war labor effort, to join things like the Victory Gardens or the Citizens Defense Corps or the Citizen Service Corps, the Savage Program. So the United States were putting out materials, persuasive materials, to try to encourage American families to be a part of the war labor effort and using their skills and getting employed so that they can help create and produce materials for the war. What you're going to see as a theme throughout this entire lesson here is that a lot of the countries, including the United States, did a lot of things to conserve so that they can help the war effort. In this case, you see here in the United States, they started rationing sugar so that they can, help with the war effort. So anything like food, clothing, weapons, war materials, etc., fuel, all of those things were, electricity, all of those were conserved and saved so that they can help to win the war. Okay, so that's your answer for number 6. Here's number 7. The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of black fighter pilots, and they were the first group of fighter pilots to fight in the U.S. military. There were no other fighter pilots. There were no other pilots. Black pilots, they didn't even consider having black pilots because most of the time black military men, they were doing menial jobs. They were not in leadership positions. They were not allowed to be in leadership positions. This was the first time that black servicemen were allowed a leadership position as such as this one. They were known as the 332nd Squadron, and they had a mission of the double V's, as you see here. One mission was to win the war, of course, right? Victory over the Axis powers. But their other mission, and this was an internal mission for black men. Their internal mission was, they figured if they're joining this war and that they're doing their best in leadership to win the war, that hopefully they would be seen as equal. Hopefully they would win the victory over racism and segregation. So that was the second mission for them, the double V mission, to try to win over racism. However, that was not the case because as the war ended, they came right back to a segregated America. Okay, so during the war, they're in segregation. As they ended the war, they came right back into a segregated America. All right, so let's continue. And we saw this in class, so I'm going to skip that for a minute. All right, here is number 8. What happened to Japanese Americans during World War II? They were placed in concentration camps. So yes, the United States did have concentration camps. It was called the Japanese internment. This is your answer for number 8. 110 Japanese Americans. These were Japanese people born in the United States. All right, because Americans at this point became extremely fearful of what they figured Japanese Americans would do. Okay, because they're fighting a war against Japan. So the government literally rounded up Japanese Americans and placed them into these relocation camps, i.e. concentration camps. And they were required to take a loyalty oath. They were required to stay there for security, quote unquote, security reasons. All right, so yes, the United States did have concentration camps. It wasn't as, how can I say, deadly per se as the German concentration camps for Jews, but it was just as bad. Okay. Of course, the United States did apologize for this, and Japanese Americans did receive reparations for this inhumane act towards Japanese Americans. Okay, All right, let's continue. This is 9 and 10. What did Hitler do to maintain morale in his country? So Germany, at the beginning of the war, they refused to cut consumer goods. So they allowed consumer good productions to happen. So that means that if they have food, if they have the resources that they needed, they wouldn't feel bad. They would feel like they're in prosperity. Okay, so that boosted the morale of Germans on the home front. Also, he decided to increase the production of weapons or armaments, okay? And that helped to boost the morale of the Germans because they feel like they are powerful, they are a world power that they can take on the Allied powers. However, that started to change when Germany was defeated by the Soviet Union and the American fronts in Europe, right? So their economic situation started to change. So, of course, with that, they had to start conservation efforts and rationing, okay? And also Nazi attitudes changed because now a lot of the men were dying in the war. So they had to change course. Although Nazi women were supposed to be the homemakers and bearing the Aryan children, right? They had to change and allow women to fill the positions that the men once worked in the factories, in the military services, so that they can help the war effort in Germany. Okay, so that's number 9 and 10. Here's number 11, and this is on the Asian theater or the Asian side of the war. Japan, on their home front, they wanted to have control over their natural resources and their resources as much as possible. Wages, labor, fuel, food, whatever. They wanted to have complete control over that. So they resorted to really manipulate the mind of their citizens by appealing to their habits of obedience to their leadership and also hierarchy. So they encouraged citizens and they really pushed and strongly encouraged citizens to be obedient to their country and be obedient to Japan and sacrifice their resources and even their lives to help them win the battle, win the war for Japan, right? Females, women employment increased, but not so much like the Soviet Union or United States or Germany. It was more so in textile and farming, not in industrial labor. Okay, so that's number 11. Here's number 12. In the final years of the war, Japan resulted, or they came to a point where they had to use a literal sacrifice of young Japanese men. And they were encouraged and even volunteered to give up their lives in suicide missions, being kamikaze fighters. And they would take their planes and do a complete nosedive into U.S. Fighting ships at sea in the Pacific. This was one of them, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa. This was one of the attacks at the USS Bunker Hill, which was a naval ship in the Pacific that was attacked by a kamikaze fighter. Okay, and we saw this video in class. I'm gonna skip that. All right, so we talked about the bombing of cities, right? Remember the Battle of Berlin, right? So early on, Germany used civilian bombings, right? Early on in the war. So they started to bomb cities in Britain. That was called the Blitz by Britain. And it was happening nightly. So all night there was bombings of the cities in London and other cities, right? So Germany thought that this was going to change and civilians would get tired of this and they would want to surrender, and this would bring about peace. It would force peace in Britain. That didn't happen because the British Army then retaliated, the RAF, came back and they bombed German cities. Many of the children, as you see here for number 14, were evacuated to avoid the bombing. So they saved 6 million children and their mothers from being bombed by the German Air Force, right? So that's number 13 and 14. And here is 15. Again, as I mentioned, British RAF, the Royal Air Force, decided to do major bombing raids on German cities once their cities were bombed, and that's what they did. It did not lower their German morale, but it did affect, as you see here, they had food shortages, clothing and fuel shortages. What it did really affect was their transportation systems and fuel supplies. With the destruction of their transportation and fuel supplies, Germany is not going to be able to get the resources that they need in order to win this war. Okay, it made it extremely difficult. And that is it for this particular lesson. You have your activity here. Take a look at this particular, these posters. The question number 16 is looking at the similarities between the posters. Number 17, tell me what is the difference in the communication or the wording, the way the wording is said in these Homefront posters. All right. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Peace.